I got a fairly lengthy letter yesterday from a listener who wanted to know and seemed disappointed that wanted to know why I hadn't, and seemed disappointed that I hadn't had anything to say, done any interviews about the incident at Pinelands High, the slave auction incident, and also about what is supposed to have been happening at Pretoria School for Girls, where the head mistress, the principal, has now been suspended, and quite a number of prefects have been suspended, and so on. And my answer was, I don't know what I can say that adds anything meaningful and positive and valuable to the discussion. Racism exists in South Africa. It exists everywhere in the world, and it exists particularly with a particular force in South Africa because of our relatively recent history, which is a long way from being scrubbed out. And if racism exists in a country, then it's going to exist in institutions within that country, like in the country's education system. And also, I don't really know what's been going on here. So the slave auction, was that a well-meaning educational project gone wrong? Let's try and understand what it might have felt like to be auctioned as a slave by auctioning as slaves colleagues of ours in the school. And then some scholars didn't want to get into the cage. Apparently there's video of a couple of them grinning broadly at what is happening, but there were others who said, no, I don't want to go in there. Don't try and force me in there. That's problematic for me. So, until you have a fuller grasp on the full dynamic, it's harder to say this should happen, what combination of education and punishment should be appropriate. The Pretoria Girls thing, a whites-only WhatsApp group in 2024 with kids who are under 18 years of old or 18, 19 years old at the oldest, which means they were born after 2000, that they want to be in a whites-only WhatsApp group is really sad. It's really sad. And the fact that they used this WhatsApp group to criticize and speak not terribly respectfully about some of their black schoolmates is also sad. And there are very important discussions to be had about some of the issues which are fueling what has gone on there and what's gone on in other schools, including one here in Cape Town, the issue of hair. What is the appropriate balance between allowing scholars to express themselves through hairstyles which are natural to the culture they come from versus a code of uniform conduct, respect for the school's history? You've got to have deep conversations about those things before you leap in and criticize. When you have children of perhaps 11 different language groups in the school, is it the right thing to do to say, we only speak English, which is the language which is common to every single one of the 35 girls in this classroom. So in this classroom, that's all we speak. And in the corridors, that's all we speak. If you want to speak to somebody who speaks the same language as you, home language, origin language, when you're on the field, that's fine. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that restrict people or does it open up discussion? I don't know. I'm joined now by diversity specialist Terry Oakley Smith. Terry, I've waffled on a bit. What do you think?
I think you've said it all, John. And I must say I really go along with what you've said. I think the trouble is that there's so much we don't know about these incidents. Like you, I also watched the video of the Pinelands so-called slave auction, and also saw some children seeming to be enjoying it, and others definitely not. And what I don't know is if it was an unpleasant experience for any of the children, where were the teachers? Where was the principal? How was this happening without any kind of adult supervision? If it was it something they knew about? Was it something they planned? So it's really difficult, as you say, to think about how this should be dealt with without understanding a lot more about it. I think what it does show, if it's indeed true, that it was colored children who were auctioning off their black colleagues, then that would be problematic. for me anyway, and shows that if it's true that in South Africa racism is not only a white on black, but we're a complex, multifaceted country, and I think racism pervades our racial groups far more than we actually acknowledge. In terms of the Pretoria one, again, it's, they talked about these girls sharing microaggressions. Now, I mean, for me, microaggressions are mainly things that people do, not necessarily things that people say. They're small acts which are attributed to race or racism. I read through what's been published about the commentaries and the girls on the group, and it was difficult to really pick up what I would understand normally as a microaggression. But I'm much more concerned that in this day and age, 12 white girls would want to be part of a whites-only group, and that to me says that we haven't come very far in 30 years with getting ourselves together as South Africans, but are still, entrenched in our racial corners. And I must say that I've been doing this work, as you know, John, for 30 years now. So it's just as well this is not television. But I must say that I think there is still so much work to do. I think for white people...
Can I come in there and ask Terry,
sorry.
What degree of responsibility for that work that needs to be done devolves to the school? Because the children don't only exist in a school; they exist in a number of environments. They exist in a home environment. Many of them exist in a religious environment. Not all of them, perhaps fewer and fewer, but they exist in post-school environments where they play sport, where they do dance or theatre or whatever. So there are all these interlocking circles where children are in the world. So how much of the responsibility is it of the school to say we are diverse, there is value, there is strength? Look at the Springbok rugby team. There is joy to be found in diversity. Let's work on exploring how in this environment we find those positives to diversity.
John, I think the biggest sort of small group that anyone is in is the family. And one wonders, what sort of things these girls were hearing from their family, from their parents, from their grandparents even. And I think that's why working in schools has to be so comprehensive. I mean, when I read that Pretoria Girls High said they'd done diversity, I'm assuming they meant they'd had a workshop. And what's really needed is something that embraces the whole community, that covers learners and educators, also the parents, also the school governing body, so that everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. It's no good just working with the pupils or the learners, I should say, because as you say, they belong to much larger sets.
Yeah, and schools will say, with some justification, that their primary job is to educate children to take up meaningful and productive places in the post-school environment, whether that is as an artisan or as a professional or as a mother or as whatever it is that their circumstances and their inner convictions allow them to be. And how much time could and should schools devote to these diversity issues? Because every classroom period that you devote to diversity is a classroom period that isn't devoted to geography or mathematical literacy or whatever it is that the students are studying.
But John, I think that, to be any of those things, to be a mother, to be an electrician, to be a professional, understanding the diversity of the people that you're going to be working with is absolutely vital. So, I mean, there's a subject in the syllabus called life orientation. I mean, that would be the perfect spot, I mean, to begin some of these discussions. And I think it's, the schools feel they've done enough because they teach about apartheid in history. What's needed now is really understanding racism and building anti-racism in our young children, in our universities as well, and also in all kinds of institutions and organizations. Because one of the main problems that workplaces, whatever they're doing in those workplaces, endure often, is that people can't get along because they don't understand each other's culture or language or whatever it is, ability. So I have to say that I think it's vitally important that where people are being educated in schools and in universities, we look at this whole issue of anti-racism very seriously. You alluded earlier to its importance, and you alluded to our history. And John, in 30 years, we've done really so little to really address this, which is, I think, also why these kind of issues are still cropping up with monotonous regularity. I mean, some of them don't make the news, but I can tell you there are many, many similar incidents happening in organizations, institutions, and schools.
Of course. And Terry, can one in the time available make a difference with programs like this? I think of the quote which is sometimes ascribed to Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Sometimes it's said to be Aristotle, but give me a child until he's 7 and I'll show you the man.
7.
So a child is coming into primary school at 6, very close to that age of 7, and is coming from a home environment which is either pro-diversity, accepting of diversity, or against it. And so, I mean, to what extent are the child's attitudes towards people of other cultures, people with other skin colors, set by those early years before they actually come into school?
John, I think it's not just about the content of what they might get in their lessons, but it's things like how many of the teachers that they see are black. Talking about this particular issue. And if those teachers are black, are they teaching anything other than Zulu or Xhosa? It's about representation as well. It's about the environment. It's about what happens, during sport. You mentioned sport. Very, very important. And, the example of the rugby team is great. But that's like one of those heroic moments that South Africa loves, but we somehow are not prepared to build on it. I think it should be part of the curriculum, and I think when we train teachers, even if they're not going to teach about this, they need to know themselves how to deal with the differences that they're going to encounter in the classrooms. So I think it's much broader than a lesson. I think it's really getting steeped in the culture and who do I see in the school and what do they do in the school. So maybe I come from a home where my parents are sometimes disparaging of black people, but look here in my school, my science teacher is black. So people get a much more diverse mixture in their lives. And I think that's important. It's not just about a lesson or a session or a workshop, but it's about a whole environment.
Thank you very much to diversity specialist Terry Oakley Smith.